in the Alberta Legislature. My name is David Carter, Speaker of the House and MLA for Calgary-Egmont. After question period today, the House will be dealing with a motion as sponsored by the member for Cypress Redcliffe, Allen Highland, dealing with the mandate of the Public Utilities Board in this province. This evening the House will sit at 8 o'clock and may well continue through till at least midnight, dealing with third readings of bills dealing with the Energy Resources Conservation Amendment Act, Tourism Educational Council, the Alberta Research Council, and the Interprovincial Lottery Amendment Act 1988. Let us pray. We give thanks to God for the rich heritage of this province as found in our people. We pray that native-born Albertans and those who have come from other places may continue to work together to preserve and enlarge the precious heritage called Alberta. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions.
Mr. Speaker, I will request leave to present the following petitions that have been received for private bills. The petition of the Donald Roy Dean for the Donald Roy Dean Compensation Act, the petition of Leo Cattleman, Simon Three Fingers, Eddie Littlechild, Jim Amisu, and Morris Wolfe for the Masco-Achese Cultural College Act.
Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions.
Member for Edmonton Highlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under the provisions of Standing Order 40, I rise to give notice that I intend to seek unanimous consent to deal with an emergency motion at the end of question period today, dealing with another fatality on 112th Avenue and the need to expand the Capilano Freeway.
Introduction of bills. Tabling returns and reports. Introduction of special guests.
Minister of Transportation and Utilities.
Mr. Speaker, it's a distinct pleasure and an honor for me to introduce to you and through you to the members of this legislature 39 grade 6 students from the Glen Mary School in Peace River, accompanied by 2 teachers and 4 parents. The teachers are Miss Hélène Berube, Mrs. Marie Woolsey. The parents are Mrs. Marianne Schell, Mr. Don Kennedy, Mr. Laurent Boucher, and Mr. Albert Waugh. I would ask them to stand and receive the warm welcome of this assembly.
Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, it is indeed a privilege for me today to introduce a group of constituents from the heart of the Three Hills constituency. They are from the Knee Hill Christian School, which is just outside of Linden. They are a group of grade 8 and 9 students, accompanied by their teacher, Miss Terry Miller, parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ray Clausen, and Mr. and Mrs. Bob Lavin. Mr. Speaker, it is the first visit to this legislature by this group. I'm very pleased to have them here today. I'd like them to rise and receive the warm welcome of the Assembly.
Public Works Supply and Services, followed by Rocky Mountain House.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today for the second day in a row to introduce to you and through you to the members of the Assembly a group of grade 6 students from Alberta's #1 constituency.
No.
There are 61 grade 6 students from the Grand Center Junior High School. They're accompanied today by teacher Sheila Jerem, Chris Holoboff, teacher's aide Tom Tucker, parents Mr. Coslow and Mrs. Lefebvre. They're seated in the public gallery, and I'd ask them to stand and receive the welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, today I'm pleased to have the opportunity to introduce to you and through you a former member of the Legislative Assembly, Dr. Winston Backus, who is seated in your gallery. Dr. Backus was first elected as the member from Grand Prairie in the general election in 1971 and again in 1975. Upon his election in 1971, he was appointed Minister of Public Works and held that portfolio until 1975. Dr. Backus is joined today by his wife Myrtle and his guests, Dr. and Mrs. Brody, who are visiting from England. I now ask that they rise and receive the warm welcome of the House.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, finally, yesterday the Premier appeared for the first time to take seriously the concerns that the Mulrooney trade deal may involve serious federal incursion into Alberta's resource jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, he certainly took great pains to make a distinction between the trade deal, which he has supported, and the enabling legislation, which he didn't seem to be sure about. Mr. Speaker, I say to the Premier, this is a distinction without a difference. The Mulroney government always said it would guarantee provincial compliance, and the Americans have demanded it. Mr. Speaker, however, for the record, to the Premier, will the Premier advise what mechanism the Alberta government has proposed to the feds to guarantee Alberta compliance with this deal?
Mr. Speaker, there has never been any guarantees in the way the honourable member has placed his question.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, the point that I'm trying to make is that the final text of the Mulrooney trade agreement has been available since last December. And Article 103 of that agreement stated clearly that state, provincial, and local governments must comply with the agreement. And we raised this in the legislature several times. My question to the Premier, in view of the fact that the Premier is now, it seems, unsure of his position, will he explain to this Assembly what, in heck, they've been consulting about for the last 2.5 years, if it wasn't consulting about how this will affect provincial powers?
Mr. Speaker, there's been no confusion on the government's point of view. That is that we have raised the need for a free trade agreement with the largest market in the world, that's the United States. And then we have worked with the other premiers and the Prime Minister to see that that becomes a reality. The free trade agreement, the agreement as itself, does not in any way intrude on provincial jurisdiction. As I said yesterday, and I would say it again to the honourable member, the implementing legislation may well have some implications that way, and we are having it assessed.
Mr. Speaker, this is unbelievable. Blind faith from Mulroney government. Surely everybody was aware that this would affect provincial powers, I guess the exception of this Premier, Mr. Speaker. But it is clear from the federal government that they believe that they have the right to pass this agreement under federal treaty-making powers. And they make it clear that this extends into provincial jurisdiction. My question to the Premier, how is it that this Premier is only waking up to the reality of this position 2.5 years into the process? Are there none so blind as those who will not see?
Yes.
I'm not so sure whether there's 2 or 3 questions there, Mr. Speaker, but let me say this. Again, I repeat, the trade agreement does not impinge on provincial jurisdiction. And the opportunity that it presents to the people of Alberta is so significant that we are looking at the federal implementing legislation to see whether we can live with it in any event, because the trade agreement is so positive for our province.
Mr. Speaker, it seems that it's so significant we're willing to give up provincial powers. That's what it comes down to, Mr. Speaker. And my question to the Premier is that the federal government can get out of this with 6 months' notice. And my question to the Premier, has the Premier determined from his national party leader in Ottawa what option is available to a gullible provincial premier who finds this agreement is not working to the advantage of a particular province? Now, of course, Mr. Speaker, I'm not mentioning any names here.
Mr. Speaker, most Albertans know how significant and beneficial this trade agreement is to our province. And they also know that the Liberals and the NDP do not support it. Well, that's clear in Alberta. That is why, Mr. Speaker, when we made this an issue in a by-election, there was overwhelming support for it. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, when you travel throughout this province and you speak to Albertans, small businesses, farmers, ranchers, they're all looking forward to the opportunity for the ability to expand their markets, to get assured markets in the United States. We are going, Mr. Speaker, to continue to support the free trade agreement. It provides an incredible opportunity for the businesses and farmers and ranchers of Alberta. It provides a whole new economic base on which to expand in the future.
Thank you. Supplementary. Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, the Premier made much of the commitment of the federal government to consulting with provincial governments during the negotiation of the free trade agreement. Could the Premier please inform the legislature whether his government was consulted by the federal government during the period of time over which they drafted this federal free trade enabling legislation? If so, what was the province's input? If not, why not?
The first question instead of two.
Mr. Speaker, I thought the member for Meadowlark would know that the minister responsible for trade, Mr. Crosby, was in the province recently, and that was one of his responsibilities.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Premier sold out Alberta, but I'll designate my second question to the member from Edmonton Highlands.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday, well, actually in previous weeks, but especially yesterday, the Conservative government in the Assembly proved its callous disregard for the parliamentary process, first by creating a bill, Bill 10, a slush fund act, and now by telling the Assembly that it's going to limit debate on that bill tonight by imposing closure. My question, that was only one sentence, my question to the Premier is this. If the Premier condones it, and I'm not sure he does, will he explain why he's condoning this heavy-handed government action to deny full opportunity for all 3 readings of this contentious bill?
Mr. Speaker, we're getting very close to debate on this matter. I'd only say that it's in the rules of the legislature. They've been placed there by the legislature. The members of the legislature put this in the rules, and to say that using it is some strange or terrible thing just isn't so. I mean, that's why it's there. Frankly, having heard the and read and studied the input on the third reading, not one new idea coming up at all, and obviously an attempt to just delay things. I think the Honourable House Leader was actually making a good recommendation to the House.
For I remind the Premier that I myself made a very good recommendation which his government defeated. Mr. Speaker, my second question to the Premier then is, does he acknowledge that there's obviously something fundamentally wrong with this bill, this slush fund bill, if the only way they can get it through, the only way you can get it through, is by imposing closure?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, that leads me to debate. No, I don't believe there's anything wrong with the bill. I think the weakness is in the head of the honourable member.
Order for half a moment, honourable members. The Chair is very concerned about this under Beauchesne 359 subsection 12. This is debate for later in the day, and it's scheduled for this evening. With respect to the Standing Order 21, as well as with regard to third reading, so great care in crafting the next question.
Mr. Speaker, I just point out that the motion for closure is not debatable. I'd have been pleased to take it up tonight. My next supplementary to the Premier then is seeing as how he's referred to the standing orders over which this current Assembly has had no authority to change, will he now commit his government to bringing back those standing orders first, that is tonight, for revision, to take the closure clause right out of them? Why doesn't he do that?
The answer to that is no, Mr. Speaker.
They don't believe in democracy.
That's right. Final supplementary to the Premier, who clearly likes to erode democracy at every chance that he can get. In invoking closure, I ask the Premier to answer one question then, just one, Mr. Premier. What is this government afraid of? Why are you doing this?
As I've already said, Mr. Speaker, the government isn't afraid of anything with regard to this legislation. This legislation follows a recommendation from the Auditor General. This legislation has been before the House. This legislation has been before the House. It's gone through 2 readings. It's gone through committee study. It has now taken a considerable amount of time to go through the process of third reading. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, all members have had an opportunity to express their point of views, and now we have other important matters to deal with.
Thank you. Westlock Sturgeon, main question or supplementary?
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. In view of the closure motion on this particular thing, could the Minister or could the Premier share with the House if he is working to any particular deadline in the next while, and therefore does he expect to use closure to get other bills through to meet this particular deadline he has in his own mind?
If the honourable member means the length of the legislature's sitting, I have no particular deadline. I'm here anyway, so Mr. Speaker, I think it'll be up to the members of the House. We'll be here as long as it takes.
Westlock Sturgeon, main question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is just further to my questions yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I've been able to determine that the letter that we're talking about is in fact 2 letters from the Alberta Weather Diversification, not diversification, Alberta Weather Modification Co-op to the Premier there, and 2 copies to the Ministers of Agriculture, both dated May 16th, Mr. Speaker. One was signed by Harold Howe, the chairman of the co-op, and the other by Jim Bishop, the research director of the co-op. My question to the Premier is, seeing in view he has one of the largest staffs known to any Premier in Canada, has he now been able to locate and read the letter?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member has just again described the letter, and he's talking about it going to 2 Ministers of Agriculture. Now that's a change from what he told us yesterday, and frankly, no. My staff has been looking for the letter and has not been able to find it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe he should use closure on his staff, but Mr. Speaker, then is the Premier aware that the counties of Wheatland, Mountain View, Rocky View, and Knee Hill have also thrown their weight behind the Weather Modification Co-op's request to reactivate the program?
Would you like? Mr. Speaker, maybe... Well, Mr. Speaker, I happen to know that they have not contacted the Premier because I was just talking to one of the representatives of one of those counties before I came into the legislature, so that's why I interjected. Mr. Speaker, I do not have a copy. In fact, my staff searched for the letter that the member referred to. The last letter that we have from anyone in that weather modification group is dated April the 16th, and they talk about $400,000, and that certainly is not the 40 million acres that the member was talking about yesterday, but let's mix up the problem with facts. I did indeed talk to the people from the county of
Rocky View, Knee Hill, Starland, Mountain View, and one more this morning, or just before I came in the legislature. And they had a meeting yesterday, and they would like to meet with me, and I've agreed to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm mixing up dollars and acres here, I guess, as the Associate Minister. So, Mr. Speaker, then, since apparently the Honourable Member from Olds Didsbury has assured the people in this co-op of his support, would the Premier allow himself to be briefed by that Honourable Member on the validity and the value of the weather modification program in this area?
Mr. Speaker, I'm always willing to listen to MLAs anywhere in the House.
Good.
Yeah. I hope the Honourable Member will exploit that opportunity. Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Would the Premier also then meet with the Director of the Alberta Research Council that's in charge of weather modification to see whether now, even at this late date, they will be able to reactivate and put weather modification program on way that was so lamentably cancelled by the exuberant Minister of Associate Minister last year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it would certainly take more investigation to decide whether that's necessary. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member has, in mixing up his questions today and going over the answered yesterday, made it almost impossible to respond on the issue because it's such a confused line of questioning that he's followed. I would think if he wanted to really get to the right kind of question, he should, in fact, ask a direct question so we can give him a direct answer.
Thank you. Vermilion Viking.
Yes, to the Associate Minister of Agriculture. If the weather modification system is such a guaranteed, absolute, proven fact as insinuated by the member for Westlock Sturgeon, could the Minister indicate if she is standing in the way of any private sector firm from going forward to those 20 million acres of cropland and asking them for a fee to put on such a magnificent program? $1 an acre would put $20 million up front, which would more than adequately allow...
Thank you, Honourable Member. We're not into the debate. Please.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in response to the first part of the member's question, rain augmentation isn't proven. We've done some research on it, definitely, and there are arguments on both sides of the issue whether or not it is effective. There's absolutely nothing standing in the way of private citizens joining together, and in fact, years ago there was a co-op in southern Alberta, just north of Calgary, which did do some ground generation to augment rain, and I've had ongoing discussions with one of the representatives of that group, and I've said on a number of occasions, if the farmers in the area and the municipalities in the area get together and come forward in a unified voice with a unified proposal, I'll certainly take a look at it and ask the government to take a look at it.
Okay, main question, Little Bow, followed by Cardston, then Calgary Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Recent statistics of the federal government show that Central Canada is still receiving a disproportionate share of federal spending. For example, in 1986, 76% of the $8.7 billion spent by the Federal Department of Supply and Services went to companies located in Central Canada, while 11.8% went to Western firms, even though we've got 30% of the population. In the aerospace industry, Quebec firms were awarded 40%, Ontario 31%, and in Alberta we're getting less than 2%. Even in light of that, the leader of the party Quebecois considers the treatment to their province shabby. My question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is if this is shabby, what is the treatment that Alberta is getting called?
Mr. Speaker, this is something that the Honourable Member and I have discussed before, and also in preparation for the Western Premiers Conference, and I draw his attention to the fact that it was the subject of a communique from that conference.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Premier, other than the figures that I've quoted here to the Premier, could the Premier indicate whether the trend that has been there for some time in Canada, our share versus the share of central Canada, is reversing itself or is improving so that we are getting a better share here in Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, obviously it takes a variety of statistics to come to a conclusion, depending on whether you consider Crown corporations, federal government, just the public service, not Crown corporations, whether you include Air Canada, for instance. There are a variety of ways in which those figures can be distorted. But basically, I think the key thing is that we are not getting the amount of federal procurement on an actual basis to equate with the percent of population in Western Canada.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Premier. The federal government's considering Alberta versus Quebec, or Quebec versus Alberta, as a site for a new $50 million hydrogen energy research authority. Could the Premier indicate the chances of Alberta getting that and what steps are being taken possibly to assure Alberta being the recipient of that authority?
Mr. Speaker, the government has been looking at the potential for that being located within our province. The chances, I wouldn't want to speculate.
Westlaw Sturgeon, supplementary.
Speaker, a short one to the Premier. In view of this equalization of opportunity in the West and East, and in view of the federal government's declaration that they're going to try to privatize TransCanada, or Air Canada, and the Petro-Canada, do you know, has this government taken any precautions to inform the federal government that we want to make sure that any privatization will be shared equally, the opportunity to participate will be shared equally in the West and the East, and it will not all end up in the Eastern brokers?
I think, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is referring to the potential for Canadians to purchase interest, presumably common share ownership. It's my understanding that that would be spread in a manner that all Canadians have equal opportunity.
Member for Edmonton Kingsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Has the Premier considered that the rather ridiculous claim that we've got a $15 billion Heritage Trust Fund has stood in the way of the federal government seriously recognizing the need that Alberta has now that our economy has gone down the drain?
The question really has precious little to do with the main question. Chair recognizes Cardston, followed by Calgary Forest Lawn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Technology, Research and Telecommunication, and it has to do with the rural individual line service. Could the Minister tell us if the individual line service is on schedule and what percent of the program will be completed this year?
Mr. Speaker, I can advise the legislature that slightly over 4,000 customers on party lines were converted to individual lines during the month of April, and that means that so far this year in excess of 10,000 conversions have been completed. With respect to being on schedule, Mr. Speaker, my information is that the program is now into a good flow, a high gear, if you will, and that we should be able to maintain the schedule.
Thank you. Supplementary, could the Minister tell us if the new digital switching equipment being installed in the exchanges will allow subscribers to transfer to adjacent exchanges, which many of them would like to do, and the completion of that?
Mr. Speaker, the provision of digital switching equipment in the various exchanges, once all of the exchanges in a given region have that kind of equipment, would make it technically possible for customers to shift from one exchange to another. However, I think before one engages in that process, there will need to be some kind of examination given to make sure that there is fairness with respect to any shift in cost that might occur. But I would say to all honourable members, Mr. Speaker, that I believe it will be possible to do it once the digital equipment is installed. That won't occur across the province, I would think, before 1991.
Thank you. Could the Minister tell us if any of the so-called Trison instruments, which is an instrument to allow privacy in the interim period, have been installed and if they're working well and to the satisfaction of the users?
Mr. Speaker, about 1,000 of those Trison instruments have been installed. Some difficulties were encountered in some exchanges. It turned out that some of the equipment, the switching equipment, had been around so long that the permutations and combinations hadn't been fully appreciated even by the experts in the area. However, those problems have been overcome, and I'm pleased to say that beginning next week, summer students have been trained to do the wiring that's necessary for houses, because they have to be rewired for the standard telephones. There will be a major program commence using summer students, and that I would expect within 6 weeks there will be at least 10,000 of those instruments in operation in the province.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister please advise if there are plans to extend the distance for extended flat rate calling from the present 40-mile limit?
Mr. Speaker, no. Currently there are no plans to extend the distance for the extended flat rate calling program. There are in fact many routes that are currently possible under the existing distances. There are, however, considerations underway which may become part of the rate application currently before the Public Utility Board. At least phase 2 will shortly commence, and through that application there may be some adjustments provided that are sensitive to the individual subscriber's needs rather than a whole exchange's requirements.
Tabasco Laklabish, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark.
I'm sorry to hear that the flat rate or the toll-free area of 40 miles is not going to be changed, but has the Minister reconsidered the possibility of allowing individuals in rural Alberta who wish to retain their party line to have that option, as opposed to making it mandatory to have everybody on the private line?
Mr. Speaker, the ability to retain the multi-party service has been considered and reconsidered. There are, as it turns out, economies, significant economies in the total program. The over 75% of the cost of individual line service is being paid not by the subscribers through the telephone system or individually, but through the Heritage Savings Trust Fund and the general revenues. And in the light of that major contribution from public taxpayers, it is considered that we must take advantage of the savings that are possible, and therefore, as is often the case with any provision of utility, we are providing a basic utility service which would be a standard of individual line service as it is developed throughout the various exchanges.
Edmonton Meadowlark.
In reconsidering the extended flat rate calling program under this new technology, will the Minister be giving some thought to meeting Mirror Alberta's request that they receive extended flat rate calling privileges to Red Deer?
Mr. Speaker, the extended flat rate calling is construed by some to be a free service. It is not a free service, not to the exchanges which receive it, and not to the recipient exchange, that is the exchange, in this case, Mirror's case, not to Red Deer residents either. So, Mr. Speaker, what our objective is is to try to identify a way of reducing the costs for subscribers who are making what I will refer to as local long-distance calls, not major distances, but in the kind of distance of Mirror to Red Deer, to find a way of reducing the long-distance toll by a particular plan that the individual subscriber may adopt for a small fee. And that would mean that those people who want to phone from Mirror to Red Deer, for instance, could, in that Mirror exchange, could subscribe to such a program, and those who did not want to have that connection wouldn't have to be involved in paying for it. And I think, Mr. Speaker, our goal of being a subscriber-sensitive system may be possible to be achieved. We're trying.
Calgary Forest Lawn, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, in April of this year, the Department of Advanced Education canceled its special subsidy for nurses requiring refresher training to re-enter the workforce. This has resulted in an escalation of costs. For example, at the Calgary Foothills Hospital, costs per student have gone up from $463 to $1,103, more than double. To the Minister of Advanced Education, why has his department decided to discriminate against individuals attempting to further their education and who are so urgently needed by our healthcare system?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there is no discrimination there. For the last 2 years, the 4 schools of nursing have received exactly the same decrease, or in this year increase, in their operating budgets as have all the other institutions, -3 last year and the +1.5 this year. In addition to that, I should say that the tuition for the schools of nursing is the lowest of all the post-secondary institutions.
Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about a special group of students, nurses seeking refresher training, and how can he justify his claim that there's no discrimination when these people, who are basically women, are required to pay the full cost of their tuition and other Albertans are not so required?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the refresher course to which the honourable member refers is that, and it was initiated a few years ago in association and agreement with the profession to bring back into the profession those people who had left it but might be attracted back because of the higher wages and the shortage of nurses at that time in Alberta. These nurses had previously received their basic education at public expense primarily, the way other students in the post-secondary system do. So there's no discrimination at all.
Well, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Hospitals and Medicare, has this minister approved the action of his colleague, which will double the cost of re-entering the profession, especially at a time when staff morale in hospitals is low as a result of a series of misunderstandings?
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, could the member repeat the question, please?
Well, I was just wondering if the minister was informed of his colleague's action and whether he approved of the fact that he's now requiring these nurses that are seeking retraining to pay double what it formerly cost them to get that retraining.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware that it was. I'll take the question as notice, however, and discuss it with him.
Well, perhaps to the Premier then, Mr. Speaker. He set up a hearing to look at morale problems in the health profession. How can he justify this tuition fee increase then, which can't help but lower morale in the profession?
Mr. Speaker, there certainly wasn't a commission set up to look at morale. There is, I guess the honourable member is referring to the commission, the Heinemann Commission, on future health care for Albertans. And this may well be something that they will want to comment on, Mr. Speaker. Other than that, I think the Honourable Minister of Advanced Education answered the member's questions very clearly. Say this about the Honourable Minister of Advanced Education, Mr. Speaker. If he continues to argue that Calgary has the best hockey team in Alberta, we'll hit him in the other eye.
Calgary Buffalo to the defense of the Flames.
Two
To my MLA, Mr. Stevie Wonder, there, the Minister of Advanced Education. I wonder if the minister could advise why he would impose a 3% limit on tuition fee increases for other students and allow what's in the range of 200 to 300% for nurses returning to further their education. Why this discrimination between students?
Mr. Speaker, there is no discrimination, but I believe there is some misunderstanding. Nurses or engineers or whatever have all received their basic education, which allows them to go out in the workforce primarily at public expense, whether it's in Alberta or in some other province. Now, in some cases, in the case of nursing, the nurses who had been in the profession for a few years had left it and allowed their registration and their qualifications to lapse. There was courses made available so that those women primarily women, could come back into the workforce if they so chose after taking those refresher courses. So it was a great opportunity for those people to upgrade skills and qualifications which they had allowed to lapse. And I'm puzzled by the use of the word discrimination when those refresher courses are compared to people getting their basic post-secondary training for the first time.
Edmonton Meadowlark, followed by Edmonton Belmont, followed by Old Stidsbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the federal free trade implementation legislation makes no bones about it. It will usurp provincial powers in areas of provincial jurisdiction. You don't have to be a lawyer to figure that out, and you don't have to wait for the Attorney General to rule on it for you. Here's the trade-off. U.S. support for free trade or provincial rights. To the Premier, is it not the case that the federal government needs to usurp provincial powers for one reason alone? The U.S. will not endorse this free trade agreement unless there is unanimous provincial support, or, better yet, unless the federal government has sufficient powers so that provincial disagreement at any time, in any way, does not matter at all.
No, Mr. Speaker.
Since the Premier's indicated earlier today that he met with Mr. Crosby to discuss the federal free trade implementation legislation, and since that legislation has still come out usurping provincial powers, is the Premier willing to confirm to this legislature that his government has already agreed to the direction of that legislation which clearly usurps provincial powers?
No, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Premier, to the Premier, one question which we need one very clear answer on in light of the fact that the U.S. government needs to know there will be no provincial disagreement on this legislation. One question, when push comes to shove, which will be the Premier's priority? Which will be the more important, free trade or provincial rights?
Mr. Speaker, there isn't that kind of a trade-off involved.
It certainly is. Given that the Premier is awaiting the Attorney General's ruling or analysis of this legislation, will the Premier please make a commitment at this time, a promise to this legislature, that that analysis will be tabled in this legislature and that this legislature will have the opportunity to discuss its implications for the future of provincial rights in this province and in this country?
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I'm not asked for the Attorney General to rule. We are obtaining legal opinions from the law officers of the Crown. They're very important legal opinions. The honourable member seems to have come to his conclusion. However, we're waiting to do it on a more reasoned basis. I've not asked for a fast decision. I've asked for a good one. And we are waiting now to have the results of that provided. As far as talking about provincial rights, Mr. Speaker, we've had in the past, it's really ironic to have a member of the Liberal Party who, along with the NDP party, who completely agreed to and supported the National Energy Program that ran roughshod over provincial rights, and to now have them say...
Thank you. Chair recognizes the member for Edmonton-Norwood.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the Premier's being so thorough. Everybody else has read it and commenting on it. Mr. Speaker, a number of Premiers have said that this is intruding into provincial rights. My question to the Premier, when's he going to get around to making a statement on this fundamental issue to Alberta?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member hasn't been listening. I just dealt with that matter with the member from Meadowlark. That is that we are getting the information from the law offices of the Crown, and when we have that, we will make a statement on it. I must say, Mr. Speaker, the legislation is not proceeding, and it is now sitting on the House of Commons order paper, and we will be able to have input to it. The key consideration here is whether or not the very, very valuable free trade agreement can be put in place in a way that helps our province so dramatically, and at the same time that we do not have a problem with an override of any provincial rights. There's nothing terribly complicated about that. That's what we're working at.
Thank you. Member for Edmonton-Belmont, speaking of stars. Right.
No, I'll keep it on this plateau, Mr. Speaker. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last Friday, the Minister of Education, in response to a question by the Leader of the Opposition, said a number of nice things about schools that are quite correct, that not all community schools are in the inner city, that some community schools or some schools do not receive community funding, and they still do some neat things too, that the government may look at corporate donations for school funding, but not once was the question that the Leader of the Opposition posed, not once was it answered, Mr. Speaker. So directly to the Minister of Education, has the Department of Education commissioned any study that would examine the effects on inner city neighborhoods of the 50% cut to community schools?
Not specifically that I'm aware of, Mr. Speaker.
Well, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commission such a study?
Mr. Speaker, we are looking at community schools and the program that they fulfill. If there is a more precise mandate which those schools should fulfill, that is exactly the question that I have put before the Community Education Association of Alberta. And certainly if members of the opposition would like to make suggestions as how they feel that the dollars for community schools might better be spent in this province, I would welcome those suggestions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that some inner city schools face closure, which directly affects the lives of inner city residents, has the Minister considered, or has the Department considered, a pilot project to assess the potential for a multi-use facility, thus allowing the facility to stay open?
Mr. Speaker, I apologize to the Assembly. I do not fully understand the question. Certainly, there are problems, and I said this last Friday, that inner city schools face which some other schools don't face. There are also problems that schools in rural Alberta face which some inner city schools don't face. The opposition is very keen on a pat answer for a problem, but I believe the problem is more complex, and I would welcome their input.
Well, quite simple.
I don't believe that there is a pat answer, Mr. Speaker, but I am curious to know as to whether or not the Minister is truly unable to pry away from Cabinet colleagues a measly 0.00035% of the total budgets so that we can adequately fund community schools and restore them to their previous level of funding.
Mr. Speaker, my first priority, as I have said in this legislature and throughout the province on many occasions,
are the students in our school system, and that is our government's first priority as part of our overall first priority being education. Community school funding is extraordinary funding which is given to about 66 schools in this province out of a total of 1,600. Those community schools get an additional approximately $37,000 to supplement the program that they are able to give by traditional sources of funding. The decision which we had to make last year with respect to funding was, one, to benefit all of the students in Alberta as best as possible. The increase in the community school budget this year of 2% brings the total to close to $3 million. I believe there may well be better ways to spend the money, as some of the ways that were outlined in the Ann Harvey report. And I believe that with important input from many groups across the province, we may well find better ways of spending those dollars in order that a lot of other people in this province can have the benefit of some of those dollars.
Calgary-Buffalo supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday, the minister could give no examples whatsoever of current programs to help inner-city or lower-income schools. I'm wondering whether she could tell us whether the government is going to do anything at all to help these inner-city and lower-income schools, since you cut the only program they did have, the Educational Opportunity Program, totally last year.
No, Mr. Speaker, the member from Calgary-Buffalo is wrong when he says that the Educational Opportunity Fund was only going to inner-city schools. In fact, it was going other places, as I've indicated, and in fact, examples I have given for some of the very difficult problems being faced by some inner-city as well as other people in this province, such as the Native Education Project, is in fact dealing with a specific learning need that is often encountered in the inner city area by Native kids. We are always looking at ways to enhance learning opportunities for young students, and again, yes, I am looking at them, and I would welcome any input from the Honourable Member for Calgary-Buffalo.
Member for Ponoka-Rimby.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary question. Would the minister indicate if she is aware of any other jurisdiction, any other province in Canada which has a program of financial support similar to the community schools program, even at its current level of dollars?
To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Speaker, Alberta is again a leader, as we are in so many other areas with respect to education and education opportunities. I'm aware of no other province that has a community school funding program.
Time for question period has expired. Standing Order 40, request, Edmonton Highlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did send around copies of the motion that I wish to ask members to endorse unanimously for consideration. I'd like to read it into the record, Mr. Speaker. It says, be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly urge the government, in consultation with the City of Edmonton, to take whatever steps are necessary to complete the northern extension of the Capilano Freeway in Edmonton as quickly as can possibly be achieved, and thus reduce traffic volumes on 112th Avenue, thereby greatly reducing the chances of any more tragic accidents occurring there. I can speak briefly to the urgency of the issue, Mr. Speaker. It is as follows. Last year, the people in the Highlands District of Edmonton became acutely aware that the traffic, in fact, was increasing in that district, not decreasing, as had been anticipated with the construction of the Yellowhead Freeway that also goes through the city from east to west or west to east. It became apparent to them that getting the Capilano Drive extension of the Capilano Freeway back on track was the only solution to getting the heavy traffic, and it is heavy, Mr. Speaker, off of 112th Avenue, which is mainly at that point a very residential district, never designed to accommodate the sort of traffic that it is currently attempting to accommodate. Now,
Mr. Speaker, I believe the honourable member is debating the motion rather than allowing the question to be put as to whether or not the motion should be debated.
Yeah. The comments are indeed to be at urgency, yes.
Yes, I was just telling the history to point out why it's urgent that we deal with it now, Mr. Speaker. The project itself had been put on hold for some time, Mr. Speaker, and it appears, I was at a community meeting last night, and a lot of people were there in the Highlands Community League, and it appears to people that if someone doesn't take the nudge, and mainly someone with the money, that is the Alberta government, that they're not going to be able to get that project on track for another 10 years. And for the last year and a half, as I say, there have been many accidents on 112th Avenue in the area, but especially between 60th and 67th Streets. The people in that community, I believe, have a right to get a commitment from the Assembly soon. They're to the point where they're keeping their kids in the backyard. They feel like they can't move at all. The traffic is really burdensome, and the one partner in this endeavor that really does have the clout and the money would be the Alberta government. That is the nature of the urgent request to consider this motion, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The request has been made with respect to Standing Order 40. Comments with regard to urgency. All those in favor of granting unanimous consent, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Motion fails under Standing Order 40.